So why do I mostly use upper body and lower body sessions only and not arms and shoulders and on and on? So I just want to clarify something here. Although the majority of our training programs uses a upper-lower split, it does not mean that at Kilo we never use body part splits. We actually do. Uh, there's about 5 or 6 body part splits that we really like that we use across the training of our clients. But the reality is we tend to use these body part splits with hypertrophy specific training, specifically during the accumulation phases. The thing is we realize that the majority of training stress or recovery inadequacy tends to happen following workouts with extreme or higher amounts of volumes. So because the accumulation phases of hypertrophy programs, we tend to use very high volume training modalities like trisets or giant sets and stuff like that. We noticed better recovery when we use a body part split instead of upper lower. If you were to do giant sets, for example, with a upper 1 on Monday and a upper 2 on Thursday, the recovery curve would be so big that by the time you're doing your upper body session again, you wouldn't be recovered fully. So by using a body part split where, for example, we could do arms and shoulders on Monday, and later on in the week, a chest and back only training session, now we're dispersing that training volume through different body parts. So by the time we're back to training the biceps and triceps, now our recovery time for these specific motor units or that specific muscle is now 5, 6, or maybe 7 days instead of 3 to 4 days. So by doing so, we're favoring recovery, and it allows us to push more volume per training sessions on these body parts during the training of our hypertrophy methods. So generally speaking, when it comes to strength or basic hypertrophy or power, we really like to use upper lower with the majority of our trainees. But in situations where we're really emphasizing purely the extreme development of hypertrophy, then we will use body part splits with our accumulation phases. With a client that has a weak lower back, not lower back pain, just a weak lower back, would I ever consider training the lower back in an isolation fashion in the A series and pushing the primary exercise later in the training program, like a squat? Well, it kind of depends, but to be honest, the majority of the time, in most cases, I would not. Unless the person has extremely low levels of overall strength. So if we're talking about like a novice, so somebody that's being introduced to strength training and his back squat number, for example, is quite low, let's say like half times body weight, then I wouldn't be worried so much. So I might actually do isolated lower back training earlier on in the training program so that he has more targeted stressor when the body and nervous system is fresh. But with anyone who has more training years behind their belt, so a intermediate or advanced that has a certain level of strength, so let's say, for example, a 1.5 body weight back squat and above, I would never do that if I'm training these primary exercises within the training session. So for example, you have a weak lower back, I will still train the squat first, and then I would keep the isolated lower back exercise for the C series, maybe the B series. Now, if I truly want to emphasize lower back strength and isolate the hip extensors fully, what I would do is now I would train the exercise early in the training, but then I would replace the primary exercise. So let's say you were planning on doing deadlift on a lower body 2, in your A series, but the lower back is really, really weak, now I would scratch the deadlift completely, and then in my A series, replace the deadlift with a good morning, for example, where now it can really load that good morning with higher average loads, with more sets when the body and nervous system is not fatigued. So you get the most out of it. But I would never follow good mornings with later on doing some deadlift or squatting. Okay. Now, the exception to the rule again is if you're really, really weak or your isolated lower back exercise is one more of stabilization, like a Superman or a bird dog or something like that. This could be done earlier on, but if you're doing like loaded back extensions, reverse hyper, standing good morning or seated good morning, or even hip thrust, I would still put it later on in the training program. The question is, some coaches in the industry say that strength training in the weight room is greatly overrated for the development of speed, and what is my opinion on this? Well, the first question is, what specifically do they mean by speed? Are we talking about like a longer distance speed? Are we talking about peak speed? Are we talking about acceleration? So I'm not really sure here the context of the definition of speed, but what I can say from experience is that strength training is highly beneficial for speed development for team sports athlete mostly, simply because the majority of team sports are done in the acceleration part of speed. And in my opinion, the stronger you are up to a certain point, especially through a long range of motion, the faster your potential to generate high levels of acceleration speed are. So to me, if I'm training athletes in these sports and I do want to improve their speed, I will still spend a decent amount of time training strength in the weight room to up their overall level of strength so that they can display acceleration to a greater level in their sports. For people who have a hard time coping with high intensity intensification phases, what are solutions to go about to help alleviate this issue? So I would have two recommendations basically, or maybe three up to a certain point. So recommendation number one is if you have a hard time dealing with really high loads, maybe you're better off having a shorter intensification phase. So sometimes what I do with athletes is with that predisposition is that my accumulation phases will be 4 weeks and my intensification phases will be 2 weeks. So my macro duration is still 12 weeks. My training blocks are still 6 weeks, but I'm spending more time in accumulation and a little bit less time in intensification. So what happens is they don't have that third week of high intensity, high load training to really, really, really create issues in the joint, or even like create higher level of central nervous system demands or arousal and on and on. So these people tend to react really well to that shorter intensification phase. Number two, what I would suggest as well is using a lower amount of overall training volume. So for example, if you're doing a 5x5 and through experience you notice that 5x5 is a little too stressful for you, well, there's nothing wrong in trying 4x5 or even 3x5 if this suits your recovery level better. Okay, so make sure that you monitor and manipulate volume according to your ability to cope with that set volume. And then number three, sometimes, and I'm not going to go into details in this, but it might be nutritional status, it might be recovery, it might be related to poor sleep pattern and lifestyle. So this is something that you maybe need to be conscious of or pay attention to. If the nutrition is inadequate, like what is your supplement program? If your sleep is poor, what can you do to improve your sleep? So these are things to look into that might eventually help with you coping with intensification training. So the question is, the person I've noticed that in a lot of our training programs or education, he rarely sees frontal plane exercises for lower body training, and he's wondering if this is maybe causing limiting factors in terms of structural integrity with the training programs. So it's a good question. It's also a question that I'm often asked. And to be honest, aside from maybe the side step up, in which you could semi-argue that it's a frontal plane exercise, it is true that we don't really have a lot of frontal plane movement with our lower body training. But the reason is, to me, and it has to come from my background, which is more with athletic training. And the thing is, with athletes, I use strength training to build a lot of overall general strength. And there's nothing better than sagittal plane movements in order to create this in a safe and effective manner. Now, when it comes to working the other planes, the thing is, let's say that I'm training a running back, and my running back will invariably need to have to do cuts and have movements that are in the frontal plane. But the problem is, if I have a running back that back squats 400 pounds and I want to work, let's say, a side lunge or a Cossack squat, now my ability to load that movement to the extent of the strength that that athlete actually has without creating stress on the articulations or the joints involved in the movement are not very high. It's really, really hard to truly load these movements in a safely manner. So instead, what I do is I tend to work these planes of movement during the conditioning sessions using modified strongman exercises. To me, that has a lot more upside to working these motor patterns, simply because now I'm able to mimic way more specifically the loads and or velocities involved in the sports. And I can do this in a much safer manner. So for me, my running back that I'm having do, like, let's say, sideways sled drags, will be able to work these muscles, the adductors and all of these muscles in a more dynamic fashion at a load that allows for the expression of power that's required for that movement in that sport. But if I were to do a 300-pound Cossack squat, to me, the risk reward instead of in terms of stressing the knee joint are just not very good. So I prefer keeping the movements in the weight room standard and really, really work on developing overall strength in the muscles. And then once I have a good amount of strength, I use the modified strongman to do all of these movements, but at movement velocities and loads that are actually more specific to sporting action. So to me, you have more bang for your buck, plus it's safer. So what is my take in using cluster sets in season with an athlete that competes in a sport where they're competing once per week? It is a possibility. That being said, personally, if I were to use cluster sets with these athletes, I would use it with power type exercises. So explosive strength, for example. So let's say you're doing snatch pulls, then you could use the cluster for these snatch pulls. And the reason is clusters are pretty intensive, and I don't want the athlete to be under too much stress in season so that it affects the performance on the field. So if you were to use cluster training with strength and you're really loading at intensities of 90% or above, and you're doing clusters, let's say classic 1-1-1-1-1 cluster, it's pretty challenging in my opinion in terms of load. And I just think it would create a negative performance on the field. So, but with explosive strength exercises, the average load is a little less, the velocities are higher, so the demands on a recovery perspective are not as great. So I think it would be beneficial. But again, just as a side note, we're talking here about highly weight room trained athletes. Okay, so what I mean by this is you could train an elite hockey player that's really, really good at playing hockey, but it does not necessarily mean that in the weight room they're elite lifters, because the hockey players' off season is quite short. So their actual amount of time they spend in the weight room will never compare with the amount of time like a thrower at the Olympics will spend in the weight room. So sometimes I feel a lot of coaches get a little too carried away in using really, really high level training modalities with athletes that would be better off in doing like a 3x3 in season as opposed to clusters at a 90 plus intensity of 1 RM. So to me, it's just a question of really knowing the level of your athlete. But if the person is really, really well trained, highly efficient, go ahead, do clusters. And I would just keep it a little bit more for explosive strength work and keep standard sets or stage descending type of stuff for strength.